The Greek gods are perhaps the most famous of all of the ancient deities. I reckon most people could list off at least half of the 12 Olympians with ease, and any self-respecting Hellenophile will be more than familiar with the names of deities such as Persephone, Hades, and Thanatos. But today, we won't be looking at any of the Olympians, nor, hopefully, any god that you would have heard of before. Instead, we're going to be looking at 5 of the most obscure Greek gods, finding out about their domains, their mythology, and how and where they were worshipped. To begin with, we have 2 deities that were worshipped exclusively in Sparta. Their names are Maton and Keraon. They are both demigods of unknown parentage, and yes, I know a demigod isn't exactly a god, but they were worshipped and they were honoured with statues, so I am including them. Now, luckily for us, it isn't very difficult to work out why, when and where they may have been worshipped. All we have to do is take a closer look at their names. Maton comes from the verb masso, meaning to work or knead dough, so we can translate his name as the kneader of dough. Thus, he is basically the god of bread making, which is kind of a cool domain to have, to be honest. But unfortunately for him, Demeter kind of has dibs on the whole bread thing in terms of the food itself. I think this guy only gets the process of making bread, which is kind of the worst bit. But to be fair, the process of making bread is pretty important in terms of the history of humanity, so there's definitely worse things to be the god of. Next up, we have Keraon, whose name comes from the verb kerao, which means to mix, and more specifically to mix wine, so we can call him the god of wine mixing. Now, in the same way that Maton isn't the god of bread itself, but rather the process of making bread, Keraon isn't the god of wine. That obviously goes to Dionysus. Instead, Keraon will be the god of mixing wine, which was common practice in ancient Greece, where they would dilute wine with water before drinking it, often in big bowls like this called a crater. Both of these deities are only mentioned in one ancient source, a play by Athenaeus called the Dipnosophists, or the Dinner Sophists, or I guess you could translate it as the Dinner Experts, who I guess were kind of like a precursor to Michelin. In this play, it mentions that both Keraon and Maton were venerated by the Spartans, whose cooks would put up statues to both the bread maker and the wine mixer in the public food hall. Unfortunately, this is the only reference to these deities, but we can assume that the Spartan cooks would worship Maton, so their bread was well kneaded, and Keraon, so that their wine was well mixed. In the same play, Dipnosophists, our next deity is also mentioned. He is also a demigod, this time worshipped in nearby Achaia, called Dapneus. Anybody who spotted the link between his new deity and the play in which he is named gets a gold star, as Dapneus comes from Dapnea, which literally means dinners. Therefore, we can call Dapneus the god of dinners, or the god of banquets. So, next time you are having some guests round for some food, it may be best to shoot a quick prayer to our mate Dapneus to make sure everything runs smoothly. And, if you are thinking of making some bread and mixing some wine, it won't hurt to throw Maton and Keraon into the mix as well. Now, moving away from any more food-related gods for the moment, we can move on to someone we actually have an image of, so at least we no longer have to rely on stock photos. And that is this guy, Geras. If we zoom out a little, you may recognise the other guy trying to fight him, Heracles. Obviously, we aren't going to be discussing Heracles today. He's pretty much the complete opposite of obscure. But what is interesting about Geras is we pretty much only find inscriptions of him on vases where Heracles is trying to kill him. Unfortunately, the myth where Heracles and Geras fights is lost to time, but we can try and reconstruct it once we find out what Geras is the god of. Luckily for us, once again, the name is pretty self-explanatory. Geras in Greek literally just means old age. Think of the English word geriatric. So Geras is both the god of and the embodiment of old age. As you can imagine, this would make him a rather feared and undeniable deity, because, as the infamous saying goes, old age comes for us all. In the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, this is pushed even further, saying that even the gods are afraid of Geras. Harsh Geras will soon enshroud you. Ruthless age would stand some day at the side of every man. Deadly, wearying, dreaded, even by the gods. So why does Geras mainly appear fighting Heracles? Well, even though the full myth is lost, to me it feels pretty self-explanatory, as after Heracles' death he is made a god, and he is therefore eternally the same age, and has quite literally fought old age, or Geras, and won. So maybe the myth that is depicted on these vases are the moments before Heracles' death, where he is fighting with the idea of old age, and eventually he wins, as he is turned into a god. Heracles also marries Hebe, the personification of youth, who is the opposite of Geras. So this may also have something to do with the myth, but we can only guess. Outside of the Heracles myth, Geras is also mentioned in Hesiod's Theogony as the son of Nyx, the goddess of the night. Cicero later adds that his father was Erebus, the personification of darkness, which feels pretty unlucky as far as parents go. So then, where was our mate Geras worshipped? Well, it's worth mentioning that old age was something to be respected in ancient Greece, as it was often that the older a man was, the more powerful and knowledgeable he was, and therefore the more respect he deserved. However, although the concept of Geras was very well respected, the god himself doesn't seem to have been widely worshipped. The sophist Physostratus mentions in his biography the life of Apollonius of Tyana, that at the Greek colony of Gadara, in modern-day
Cardiff,
they worship and set up altars for Geras. So here is one of the few places where he must have been worshipped. Interestingly, this does seem like a rather rare practice, as Physostratus almost mocks them for it, saying that it is only because they are at the extreme end of Europe and they are extremely religious that they worship Geras. He even compares it with the worship of Thanatos, the god of death. The final god we're going to cover in this video was a local deity, worshipped solely in Athens. His name was Kiametes. His name quite literally means bean market, so we can say he would have been called something like Bean Man or Bean Market Man, and he is the god of, you guessed it, beans, or more specifically, broad beans. Unsurprisingly, not much is known about Kiametes, but he was either a hero or a demigod, who was venerated for his cultivation of beans. So I'm assuming he was either the first to grow beans in the Athens area, or maybe he just had a great knack for growing them. One of the only mentions of him in the classical sources comes from Pausanias, a Greek traveller and geographer, who states that on the road from Athens to Eleusis lies a small sanctuary dedicated to Kiametes. He says, "I cannot state for certain whether he was the first to sow beans, or whether they gave this name to a hero, because they may not attribute to Demeter the discovery of beans." Kiametes must have been associated with Demeter, who was the goddess of the harvest and of crops, but he also would have been associated with the Eleusinian Mysteries, a sort of secretive cult concerning the kidnapping of Persephone by Hades, as not only was his sanctuary on the way to Eleusis, but Pausanias goes on to say that whoever has been initiated at Eleusis, or has read what are called the Orphica, knows what I mean, suggesting that those who had been initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries would know more about Kiametes. But unfortunately, as hinted by the name, the Eleusinian Mysteries were very secretive, so our information on Mr. Beanman is quite limited. Plutarch also mentions the shrine to Kiametes, saying that it had fallen into disrepair and ruin. But he also talks about a bean market that lied on the same road as this shrine, and due to Kiamity's name quite literally meaning bean market, it isn't too big of a stretch to suggest that this bean market was probably linked to his worship and to his sanctuary, leading to Kiamites to be lovingly dubbed the god of beans and patron saint of bean markets, which, out of all the godly domains, definitely isn't the most powerful, but I'm sure he isn't complaining. So, that finishes up our 5 new obscure gods. To conclude, we have Maton, the god of bread kneading, then Keraon, the god of wine mixing, and Deipneus, the god of banquets and dinner. Then we had Geras, the god of old age, and finally Kiamites, the god of beans and patron saint of bean markets. So, if you ever find yourself making some nice fresh sourdough to go with some freshly mixed wine and a side of broad beans for a lovely dinner with your elderly friends, you now know who to pray to make sure all goes smoothly. All the best.